Greetings, ladies and gentlefish, and today I'm going to bring you the second video in my series trying to give people an idea of how to play the game World of Tanks. And today I would like to talk about guns, the various different types of guns you get in the game, what they do differently, and try and kind of dispel some of the reasons that you get people call hacks in the game. You know, they think something's impossible from a gun and it's not, it's just a different type of gun that behaves differently. But before we talk about guns, really I think we need to talk about ammunition first. There's a variety of different types of ammunition in the game, and so I'm going to try and cover them all. Starting with the humble armor piercing round. So you can see here, for instance, we are looking at the Chiri. The Chiri has got 3 different types of ammo available to it, 2 of which are armor piercing. So armor piercing, what is an armor piercing round? Well, it's basically just a solid projectile. It's a big bullet that the tank fires out and passes through, hopefully passes through the target that it's aimed at. So armor piercing, when it reaches the target, it will either ricochet if the armor's too thick and it can't penetrate, or it will penetrate. If it penetrates, then it will do some damage. And if it hits, say, a critical module of the enemy tanks, so like an engine or something, it will knock it out. As I say, if it doesn't penetrate, it will just bounce. And generally speaking, this is the standard type of ammunition used by most guns in the game, used by pretty much all anti-tank guns. And it will be your bog standard ammunition, bought for credits, you know, you can fire it and generally make a profit, that sort of stuff. Occasionally, you will find, as in the case of the Chiri, for example, that you can also fire it as a secondary type of ammunition. So let's just have a quick look at some armor piercing. Here's an example of an armor piercing round. If you right click on the round, it tells you the caliber of the round. So this is a 75mm round, 75mm gun. It will tell you a range of penetration values that round can have. So this has penetration, every time you fire a round, the penetration is randomized, as is the damage of that round. So this has penetration ranging from 116 to 194. So that means that at this round, at 100 meters, these are all for 100 meters, at 100 meters, this armor piercing round, if you got unlucky, could penetrate 116mm of armor. And if you got lucky, could penetrate 194. And the damage, average damage on the round again, is also randomized, and you can see it down here, 98 to 163. And it also gives you a list of compatible guns for this armor piercing round. And so this is your standard credit firing, credit ammunition. Sometimes some tanks, I'm using the Chiri as an example here, can also take armor piercing as what's known as their premium ammunition, or a lot of people call it their premium ammunition. Because back in the day, the only way you could buy this stuff was by using gold, a currency that you have to put money into the game in order to get, real money. But now you can buy it for credits, it's just a lot more. So if we look at this ammunition, we can see that it's identical in every respect except for the penetration. Whereas this has a penetration value of 116 to 194, with premium ammo, that goes from 140 to 233. So the special ammunition, the better armor piercing ammunition, is more likely to go through armor. Well, why would you not just use this all the time? Well, we can take a... If we look in the service, we can see that standard credit ammunition, the standard armor piercing, costs 140 credits per round. You can see it here. The upgraded armor piercing ammunition costs either 8 gold or 3,200 credits per shot. It's expensive to fire it, so generally you only want to take a little bit with you. So that's armor piercing. Next type I want to talk about, armor piercing composite rigid. You can see an example here. So this is very similar to armor piercing. So here's, in the case of this gun, here's our armor piercing round, and here's our armor piercing composite rigid round. Now you can see, mechanically in the game, what's the difference? Well, the difference here is, it's much like our previous example, it has higher penetration, basically. And again, you will pay more credits for this. So, for example, I mean, this is APCR is generally your gold ammo, your premium ammunition. The Chiri uses a different type of armor piercing. The Pershing, in common with a lot of other tanks, uses armor piercing composite rigid. So again, just to compare prices, if we look at the service, the regular ammo costs 255 credits each. The APCR costs 4,400 or 11 gold. In the real world, how does this stuff work? Well, the simplest example of APCR ammo is what's known as armor-piercing discarding sabot, APDS ammunition. And that works by having a section of the shell that is discarded during flight, and it just releases this much smaller dart. So what you do is that you take all of that explosive power from, say, your 90mm gun, and you concentrate it in the dart that actually hits the target. You discard the rest of the shell after it's been fired, and as a result it has a higher penetration value. Often the shell travel times are higher for that sort of ammunition as well, and if you're shot by it, you can often tell because the holes will be slightly smaller than if you're shot with regular armor piercing ammo from the same gun. One thing to bear in mind, often people are facing, for example, tier 10 and tier 9 medium tanks, and if they've got a mod that tells them what sort of ammunition someone is firing at them, they'll see it's APCR and they'll go, oh, you're a premium gold noob or something. A lot of people don't like it when you fire, if you fire that ammunition at them. But there are some tier 9 and 10 medium tanks in particular that fire APCR as their standard ammunition. It's their standard credit bought ammunition. Anyway, so AP and APCR are very, very similar in how they work. You then have high explosive. We have an example here. So if we go back to our armor piercing, 90mm armor piercing, and we compare it with our 90mm high explosive, you can see a variety of differences. So caliber is going to be the same. First difference, the penetration on the high explosive ammunition is lower. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing is that the damage per shot is higher, and it also has a burst radius. So high explosive ammunition, as the name suggests, explodes on impact. You are just basically lobbing an explosive shell at somebody. Now, these tend to have lower shell travel times, but obviously because it explodes, it will have a burst radius. So if someone is within that distance of the explosion point, they may still take some damage. And high explosive rounds tend to be very good for knocking out critical modules, knocking out guns, disabling tracks, etc. And when they hit the tank, they explode on the surface. So officially, you are always guaranteed to do some damage. In practice, you do get high explosive rounds bounce, but when would you want to use these rounds? Well, you can see that. Okay, perhaps I should say, with their lower penetration, they generally don't penetrate. If they do penetrate, they will do their full damage, so in this case 240 to 400. If they don't penetrate, they will just do a much smaller amount of damage. But they will probably do some damage, that's how they're designed. So generally speaking, you might want to switch to a high explosive ammo from your armor piercing in one of three scenarios. One, you're facing a very, very weakly armored opponent. Maybe you're facing, an artillery piece or a tank destroyer without much armor, or a light tank or something like that. And if you switch to the high explosive ammunition, if you think you've got a good chance of penetrating them, then you'll do more damage with your shot. Second reason you might want to fire HE, maybe you want to track someone, you want a good chance of tracking them, or doing some sort of module damage. I said there were going to be three scenarios, there's going to be four. The third one, if you fire at a target that has a lot of armour that you don't think your regular armour piercing round can penetrate, maybe you want to fire high explosive at them, because then you'll at least do some damage, particular module damage. Finally, if someone's sitting in the capture point and you want to reset their capture score, if you fire high explosive at them, you are almost guaranteed that it will do some damage, and therefore you will reset. Whereas if you fire armor piercing, you might bounce. So there's some situations in which you might want to fire high explosive ammunition, so it's normally worth keeping a few rounds of high explosive. There are some exceptions to this in my opinion. For example, let's look at the Matilda. The Matilda's a bad example. Let's look at the AMX. So, no, bad example. Sorry, let's change again. Let's look at the LTP. So if we look at the LTP, you are dealing with 45mm high explosive rounds if you deal with the high explosive, and if you look at them, penetration's rubbish, the damage isn't very good, and the burst radius is really small. Basically, these rounds are garbage. So on very small caliber guns, you may not want to use them at all. But for most tanks, it's normally worth keeping a couple of rounds of high explosive just lying about. Next type of ammo I want to talk about is HESH ammo, high explosive squash head. Now this is ammunition that is unique to the British. Some of the higher tier British tanks use it, most famously the tier 10 tank destroyer, the FV215B183. I don't have any examples to show you, but basically all high explosive is in game, sorry, all HESH is in game is high explosive with abnormally high penetration. This means you have to be careful of it because you are more likely to be penetrated by the high explosive ammo and therefore take full damage from the HE round, which can be an awful lot. And if it doesn't penetrate you, it'll still do some damage. So it can be quite dangerous. But I'm not going to spend much time talking about that. Mechanically, how is it supposed to work in the real world? Well, it's designed such that when it hits your tank, it explodes on your tank, creates a shockwave that goes through the armour and dislodges a load of bits of metal and inner armour plating on the inside of the tank. A HESH round is designed to shred the crew on the inside, which is horrible, but that's the Brits for you. And so that's a British piece of ammunition that you might want to bear in mind. The last type of ammunition I want to talk about is heat ammo, high explosive anti-tank. I'm not going to get into exactly how this works because it's quite complicated. If you want to know, you can look it up. But basically, heat ammo is the highest penetration ammunition in the game, essentially. It uses high explosives to punch a stream of metal through the armour of the enemy tank, basically. So, here is a tank with a gun that uses heat ammo. So I'm just going to show you the different types of ammunition. So here's the armour piercing that we've already discussed. Here's some high explosive that we've already discussed, and here's some heat ammo. And you can see that of the three, the heat ammo has by far and away the highest penetration, going up to a massive 313mm if you roll well, potential penetration with the high explosive anti-tank ammunition. In fact, the lowest penetration roll on this heat ammo is better than the best penetration rolls on either of the other two types of ammunition. So heat can be very, very scary ammunition. The other thing I should also point out about the different ammunition types, high explosive and high explosive anti-tank do not lose penetration with range. Armor piercing does, the shell slows down, and the high explosive rounds don't lose penetration because their penetration doesn't rely on shell velocity. It relies upon the explosion, which is not going to diminish with range. Armor piercing composite rigid tends to, the penetration drops off faster with range, with distance, than any of the other rounds, so that's something worth bearing in mind. So there are the different ammo types. Let's think about the different types of gun. So let's start off with your kind of standard sort of gun. This is what guns tend to look like in the game. So it gives you the caliber of the gun, so this is a 57mm gun. Rate of fire, so that's the number of rounds the gun will fire per minute. I should point out, these values will be affected by some of your crew skills. A better crew member can make better use of the gun. So all these values that you can get by right-clicking on the gun in question are assuming a 100% crew. So rate of fire is the number of rounds the gun will fire per minute. Average penetration, and average damage. You can see there are three values for each. That is for each of the different types of ammunition this gun can load. Now you saw when we considered the ammunition that penetration and damage values had a range of values they could possibly take. The values quoted on the gun are the average values. Okay, so in this case we've got armor piercing on the left, armor piercing composite rigid in the middle, and high explosive on the right. Dispersion at 100 meters. That is how many meters the shot on average will have moved from the center of your aiming reticule at 100 meters. It's a measure of how accurate your gun is, basically. Aiming time is how many seconds it takes your aiming reticule to close in fully, and weight just gives you the weight of the gun. So with a standard anti-tank gun. You'll generally have 3 different types of ammo. They're normally armor-piercing, some sort of premium round, normally armor-piercing composite rigid, but it does change, and a high-explosive round, so much like this. So this is your standard kind of anti-tank gun. Okay. Second type of gun you can get would be a howitzer. So let's just change to a machine that can use a howitzer. Let's look at the Cruiser Mark II. So the first thing that is noticeable about this gun is that it only fires 2 types of ammunition. High explosive and high explosive anti-tank. And that's kind of one of the distinctive things about most howitzers. They don't tend, with a couple of exceptions, they don't tend to carry an armor-piercing round, and that's because originally they're not designed to take out tanks. I mean, this is a tank game, so you can use them on tanks, but that wasn't what they were designed for. They were designed for taking out machine gun emplacements, clearing roads of debris, knocking buildings out, things like that. So the sort of characteristics you can expect with a howitzer compared with a regular anti-tank gun. Generally speaking, they fire much more slowly. You don't have an armor-piercing round, as I said, so generally speaking you'll be firing high explosive ammunition. So you will often not be actually penetrating with your round, the round will just be exploding on them and you will be doing some damage to them. They tend to have quite high dispersion, i.e. they're not very accurate. It tends to take quite a long time for the gun to aim. So basically it's a gun that can do a lot of damage in one shot, but is not very accurate and takes a long time to reload. But if you're in a very thinly armoured tank, howitzers with high explosive rounds can kill you in one shot, depending on what sort of tank you're in. So you do have to be very careful about them. So that's the howitzer. Next sort of gun, the autocannon. So let's go and bring up an example. Here's an autocannon. And I'm just going to go back to an example of a regular anti-tank gun just to compare this with. So, there we go. There's an anti-tank gun. And here is our autocannon. Autocannon, what is an autocannon? Well, it's basically a machine gun. Or at least a gun that fires incredibly rapidly. So, what are the general characteristics of an autocannon? Well, firstly, it will tend to be smaller caliber. So the highest caliber autocannon I can think of is 50mm. 30mm maybe, I can't remember. Not very large caliber. So it will tell you the number of shells in the magazine. So autocannons, in common with another type of gun I'm going to get onto in a second, autocannons have a magazine, and the offset is that it takes a long time to load that magazine, but once it's loaded you can expend all of the ammunition in it quite quickly. And so this tells you how many shells are in the magazine. In this case it's 50. Okay? Time to load one shell, 0.13. So it quickly loads between shells in a magazine. Time of complete loading, that's how long it takes you to load the complete magazine. Now, autocannons suffer from low penetration. This has a penetration of only 22mm, which is pitiful, and low damage per shot, only 8 damage per shot, but bear in mind, you can fire off all 50 shells in that magazine incredibly quickly. Which means that if you can unload a magazine into someone with this gun, on average, assuming every shot penetrates, and they won't, but assuming every shot penetrates, you can do 400 damage. This is on a tier 2 machine. The average health of a tier 2 machine is about 160. Okay? So you're kind of getting an idea of what this thing's about. Dispersion at 100 meters, it's not very accurate. Aiming time, in this case, is quite good. That tends to vary a little bit. So what an autocannon is good for is driving up to someone quite close, shooting them in the sides or the rear where their armour tends to be quite thin, and being able to kill a tank or possibly 2 tanks in a matter of a couple of seconds before they've had a chance to shoot back at you, because you just unload your magazine into them and they die. That's the idea. Disadvantages: it takes you a long time to reload that magazine, so if someone engages you while you are still reloading that magazine, you have problems. You need people to support you. Second problem: these are basically machine guns. You lose penetration with range at a ridiculous rate, and you didn't have much penetration to start with, so you really do have to be quite close in order to use them. So that's an autocannon. The last type of gun I want to talk about, well, I'll talk about 2 more, I suppose. So the next sort of gun I want to talk about is an autoloader. I've kept the autocannon up because an autoloader is very similar. You can see it has similar stats and similar way of laying the stats out. The main difference with an autocannon, with an auto-loading gun, again you have that magazine, but instead of firing a machine gun, so in the case of an autocannon, every time you pull the trigger you'll fire off multiple shots. In the case of an autoloader, that's not necessarily true. It's a regular anti-tank gun. It can just fire off those shots in the magazine very quickly, and again it gives you very good burst damage, i.e. the amount of damage you can do in one magazine is quite high. So for example, this is a tier 6 light tank. It stores 6 shells in its magazine, and the average damage on the gun is 110. So this means average damage from its magazine is 660. That's more health than it has. More damage than it has health. Again, the disadvantage, if someone catches you out while you're reloading that magazine, you have problems. It's not particularly accurate, they tend to have quite long aiming times. The penetration doesn't tend to be great, but it's better than an autocannon. And generally speaking, auto-loading guns are feared, and they are one of the trademarks of the French nation of tanks. And you can see here, this is a French tank. And it comes with an auto-loader. Okay. The last sort of gun I suppose I should really talk about is artillery guns. I'm giving these a separate section, although really they don't necessarily deserve it. So, an example, here's an artillery gun. Boom. Basically these are howitzers, generally speaking. But they do even more damage per shot and are even less accurate and take even longer to aim and have an even slower rate of fire. But they're essentially howitzers that you fire generally indirectly. So they are the different types of ammunition and the different types of gun in the game. So hopefully that will inform you what you're coming up against, and you won't be surprised if, for example, you're driving around in a tier 2 game and someone comes up to you and puts, in this case, 5 shells into you in very quick succession. So in 2 seconds in this case, the first shell is already loaded and half a second between each subsequent shell. Puts 5 shells into you in 2 seconds for a total of 150 average damage and kills you. And you won't claim that this is a massive hack. It's not. You've just faced an auto-loading gun. Or maybe you've faced an autocannon. Or whatever. Okay? So hopefully that's given you some idea about the different guns and different ammunition types available in the game. I hope you find it useful, informative, instructive, whatever. And as ever, I wish you very happy hunting on the battlefield. Ciao, ciao.